There is a saying among the oldest species in the galaxy. It goes something like this: do not fear the creature that has conquered 1,000 worlds. Fear the creature that almost destroyed itself 100 times and still refused to die. For 60,000 years, the Galactic Council kept records of every intelligent species that crawled out of the mud of their home planets. They catalogued them. They measured them. They ranked them. And when they finally turned their ancient eyes toward a small blue planet orbiting a very average yellow star, they wrote one word in the file and closed it: unremarkable. That single word would become the greatest mistake in the recorded history of the galaxy. But nobody knew that yet. Not the 12 elder races who sat on the High Council. Not the military commanders who ran the most powerful fleet ever assembled. Not the professors of the legendary Veyrath Academy, where the children of 100 species came to be forged into officers and leaders. Nobody knew. And that is exactly why this story matters, because the galaxy was about to learn something it had forgotten a long time ago. The most dangerous thing in the universe is not power. It is potential that nobody bothered to measure. The transport ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel with a sound like tearing metal. Inside the cramped passenger hold, 200 new cadets sat in rows of hard seats bolted to the floor. Most of them were already in their species-specific pressure suits or environmental adapters. The air inside the ship had been set to a Veyrathi standard, which meant it was cold and thin and tasted faintly of copper, not comfortable for most species. Definitely not comfortable for a human. Ethan Cole sat in the last row, pressed against the curved wall of the hull. He was 22 years old. He had brown hair cut short in a military style. His eyes were a dark shade of green, and right now they were fixed on the small viewport beside his seat. Through the scratched glass, he could see their destination growing larger with every passing second. Veyrath Academy. It sat on a moon called Dravos, orbiting a gas giant so large it filled half the sky. The Academy itself was enormous. It covered almost the entire surface of the moon. From this distance, it looked like a city made of black glass and silver metal, with towers that reached so high they seemed to touch the edge of space itself. Ethan had seen pictures, but pictures did not capture the scale of the place. It made everything humans had ever built look like toys. He let out a slow breath and leaned back in his seat. His chest was tight, not from the thin air, though that certainly did not help. It was tight because in approximately 40 minutes he would step off this ship and become the first human to ever attend Veyrath Academy, the first human to even be allowed on the moon. And he knew with absolute certainty that almost nobody there wanted him. Humanity had only made contact with the wider galaxy 11 years ago. In galactic terms, that was yesterday. Most species spent centuries going through the process of integration. They were studied. They were tested. They were slowly introduced to galactic society through carefully managed programs. Humans had not been given that luxury. They had stumbled into contact by accident when an experimental faster-than-light drive had torn open a hole in space right in the middle of a Veyrathi trade route. The Veyrathi ship that nearly collided with the human vessel had been carrying a diplomatic envoy. Within 6 hours, humanity went from being alone in the universe to being very much not alone, and the galaxy did not quite know what to do with them. Humans were strange. That was the general consensus. They were not particularly strong compared to species like the Drakani, who stood 8 feet tall and had bones reinforced with natural metallic compounds. They were not particularly fast compared to the Silvari, who could move so quickly they appeared to blur. They were not particularly intelligent compared to the Orvani, whose brains had 3 times the neural density of a human brain. On paper, humans were average at best, a middle-of-the-pack species with soft skin, fragile bones, and a strangely short lifespan. The Council had reviewed the data and assigned humanity a development rating of Category 6. There were 12 categories. 6 was exactly in the middle. Unremarkable. But Ethan was here. Against all odds and against the wishes of more than a few council members, a single human had been granted admission to the most prestigious military academy in the galaxy. It was supposed to be a gesture of goodwill, a diplomatic move. Most people understood it for what it really was, a test. The council wanted to see what a human could do when placed alongside the best young minds and bodies the galaxy had to offer. And they fully expected the answer to be, not much. The transport shuddered as it entered the atmosphere of Dravos. Ethan gripped the armrests of his seat and watched the viewport turn white with heat. Around him, the other cadets were talking in low voices. Most of them were Verthi, tall and lean, with skin that ranged from deep blue to silver grey. They had sharp features and eyes that glowed faintly in low light. They moved with a natural grace that made Ethan feel clumsy just watching them. A few seats ahead, a group of Dracaani cadets sat in reinforced seats that had been specially installed for their weight. They were laughing about something, a deep, rumbling sound that Ethan could feel in his chest. Nobody was talking to him. Nobody had talked to him for the entire 14-hour journey. He had expected that. He had prepared for it. But expecting something and experiencing it were two very different things. The ship broke through the clouds, and the academy spread out below them like a vast, dark jewel. Landing pads extended from the main structure like the petals of a mechanical flower, each one large enough to hold a dozen ships. Ethan could see other transports already docked, their passengers streaming out in orderly lines. He watched a group of silvery cadets moving down a ramp, their movements so fluid and synchronized they looked like a single organism. The transport settled onto a landing pad with a heavy thud. The restraints on Ethan's seat released with a click, and around him the other cadets began to stand. He took one more breath of the thin coppery air, and then he stood up too. His bag was under his seat. It was small. The academy had sent a list of approved personal items, and it had been very short. He pulled the bag out, slung it over one shoulder, and joined the line of cadets moving toward the exit ramp. The moment he stepped outside, the cold hit him like a wall. Dravos had an average surface temperature of about 4 degrees above freezing. The sky was a pale violet color, and the gas giant hung above them like an enormous eye, its bands of orange and brown swirling slowly. The air was thin enough that Ethan had to take deeper breaths than normal, but it was breathable. Barely. A Veyrathi officer was waiting at the bottom of the ramp. She was tall, even by Veyrathi standards. She wore a uniform of black and silver, and her expression was the kind of blank that took years of practice to perfect. She held a datapad in one hand and was checking names as cadets filed past her. When Ethan reached her, she looked at him for a long moment. Her glowing eyes moved from his face to his bag to his boots and then back to his face. She did not say anything for several seconds. Then she looked at her datapad. "Ethan Cole," she said. It was not a question. Human. "Yes," Ethan said. She made a note on her datapad. "You will be assigned to Training Group Keth 7. Your quarters are in the Eastern Residential Block, Level 42, Room 917. She paused and looked at him again. "The environmental controls in your room have been modified to accommodate your species. If you require further modifications, submit a formal request through the administrative system." "Thank you," Ethan said. She had already moved on to the next cadet. Ethan followed the general flow of cadets into the main building. The corridors were wide and high, built to accommodate species of all sizes. The walls were made of a dark material that absorbed light, giving everything a slightly muted quality. Holographic signs floated in the air at every intersection, displaying directions in dozens of languages. Ethan's neural translator, a small device implanted behind his left ear, converted them all into English with a slight delay. He found his way to the Eastern Residential Block after about 20 minutes of walking. The building was enormous, a tower that stretched up so high he could not see the top from ground level. He took a lift to level 42 and walked down a long corridor lined with doors. Each door had a small panel beside it that displayed the occupant's name and species. He passed doors belonging to Veyrathi cadets, Dracanani cadets, Salvari cadets, and species he did not recognize. When he finally reached room 917, the panel beside the door read Ethan Cole, and underneath it, human, and underneath that category 6. He pressed his hand to the panel, and the door slid open. The room was small. There was a bed, a desk, a storage unit, and a narrow window that looked out over the surface of Drevos. The environmental controls had indeed been modified. The temperature was warmer than the corridor outside, and the air was thicker and richer with oxygen. It was still not exactly comfortable, but it was livable. Ethan set his bag on the bed and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the alien landscape. Everything was grey and black rock, with no vegetation visible anywhere. In the distance, he could see the curving edge of a massive training arena, its walls rising hundreds of feet into the violet sky. He had made it. He was here. Now the hard part began. The first assembly was held 3 hours later. in a hall so large that Ethan's mind struggled to process its dimensions. The ceiling was hundreds of feet above them, supported by pillars that looked like they had been grown rather than built. Thousands of new cadets stood in neat rows on the polished floor, organized by training group. Ethan stood in the rows assigned to Keth 7 and tried not to notice that there was a noticeable gap between him and the cadets on either side. His training group consisted of 12 cadets. 3 Vairathi, 2 Drakani, 2 Silvery, 1 Orvani, 2 members of a species called the Thessari who resembled tall insects with crystalline wings, 1 member of a species he did not recognize, and him. 12 cadets who would train together, compete together, and be evaluated together for the next 4 years. Ethan had studied their files during the journey. Every single one of them had scored in the top fraction of a % of their species on the entrance examinations. Every single one of them came from families with military or political connections, and every single one of them had been training for this since they were children. Ethan had been a mechanic on a cargo ship before the human government selected him for this program. He had scored well on the aptitude tests they had administered to every human between the ages of 18 and 25, but he had no military background, no political connections, no years of specialized training. He was here because he was the best option humanity had on short notice, and even he knew that was not saying much. The commandant of the academy stepped onto a raised platform at the front of the hall. He was an old Vairathi with skin so dark it was almost black, and eyes that burned like white stars. His name was High Commander Vorath Drain, and he had been running the academy for over a century. When he spoke, his voice carried through the hall without any visible amplification, deep and resonant and utterly commanding. "You are here because you have been judged worthy of this place," he said. "But judgment and worthiness are not the same thing. Judgment is a decision made by others based on what they see on paper. Worthiness is something you will prove or fail to prove with your own hands, your own minds, and your own will. This academy does not care about your species, your family name, or your government's opinion of your potential. This academy cares only about what you can do." He paused, and his burning eyes swept across the assembled cadets. For a fraction of a second, Ethan thought those eyes lingered on him, but it might have been his imagination. "Many of you will not complete the program," Vorath continued. "That is not a threat. It is a statistical reality. The demands we place on cadets are extreme, because the demands of service to the galaxy are extreme. If you cannot meet those demands, you will be sent home. There is no shame in that. There is only shame in refusing to give everything you have before that moment comes." The assembly lasted another hour. There were introductions of senior staff, explanations of rules and schedules, and a brief history of the academy that stretched back thousands of years. Ethan listened carefully and recorded everything on the small personal device he had been issued. When the assembly ended and the cadets were dismissed to their training groups for initial orientation, Ethan turned and found himself face to face with the largest Drakani he had ever seen. The Drakani stood well over 8 feet tall. His skin was dark green, almost black, and covered in a pattern of ridges that ran from his forehead down to his jaw. His eyes were gold-colored, and they were looking down at Ethan with an expression that was difficult to read. "You are the human," the Drakani said. "I am," Ethan said. He had to tilt his head back to meet the Drakanani's eyes. "My name is Torak Ven. I am assigned to Keth 7. As are you." "Ethan Cole. Good to meet you." Torak studied him for a long moment. "I have read about your species. You are not strong. You are not fast. You do not have natural armor or enhanced senses. I am curious what you think you will accomplish here." Ethan had been expecting this kind of conversation. He had rehearsed answers in his head during the long journey. But standing here in the shadow of this massive being, all those rehearsed answers seemed inadequate. "I guess we will find out," he said. Torak made a sound deep in his throat that might have been a laugh. "Yes, I suppose we will." They walked together to the orientation room, though together was perhaps too generous a word. Torak walked, and Ethan walked in the same direction, and they happened to arrive at the same place. The rest of Keth 7 was already there, seated around a circular table made of the same dark material as the walls. Ethan took the only empty seat, which placed him between one of the Thessari and the Orvani. The Orvani was small, barely 4 feet tall, with an oversized head and enormous dark eyes. Her name was Lyra Voss, and she was looking at Ethan with naked curiosity. "I have 17 questions about human biology," she said by way of greeting. "May I ask them?" "Maybe later," Ethan said. "I will hold you to that." Their training group leader arrived a few minutes later. She was a Varathi officer named Sub-Commander Sarath Kale. She was younger than most of the officers Ethan had seen so far, but she carried herself with the same precise authority. She stood at the head of the table and looked at each of them in turn. "I am your group leader for the duration of your time at this academy," she said. "My job is to push you further than you think you can go, and then push you further still. Your job is to survive it." Her eyes stopped on Ethan. "I understand we have a unique situation this year. I want to be clear about something. I will not lower standards for anyone. I will not raise them either. You will all be evaluated against the same benchmarks. If that seems unfair to any of you, I suggest you reconsider whether you belong here." Nobody said anything. Ethan met her gaze and did not look away. The first day of actual training began the following morning. Ethan's alarm woke him at what the academy called 4th hour, which corresponded roughly to 5 in the morning Earth time. He dressed in the standard cadet uniform, a fitted suit of dark grey material that adjusted to the wearer's body temperature. His version had been slightly modified with additional thermal insulation because the standard version was designed for species that tolerated cold far better than humans. The first session was physical conditioning. Keth 7 gathered in a training room that was 3 stories tall and filled with equipment designed for species ranging from the tiny Orvani to the massive Dracani. Sub-Commander Sarath stood at the center of the room and explained the evaluation. "You will each complete the standard baseline assessment. This will measure your strength, speed, endurance and agility relative to your species norms. The results will establish your starting point." The assessment was brutal. Each station was calibrated to the specific species of the cadet using it, which meant the difficulty was supposed to be equivalent for everyone. But Ethan quickly realized that equivalent did not mean equal. The strength test required him to push against a resistance system that increased in increments until he could no longer move it. The Dracani cadets pushed theirs to levels that would have crushed Ethan flat. The speed test involved running a course that shifted and changed as you moved through it, requiring constant adaptation. The Silvery cadets completed it so fast the monitoring system had to replay their runs at reduced speed. Ethan did his best. He pushed the resistance system as far as he could, feeling his muscles burn and his joints ache. He ran the speed course 3 times because the system flagged an error the first. 2 times, unable to believe a cadet could be that slow relative to the baseline. He completed the endurance test by refusing to stop even when his body was screaming at him to quit. And when it was over, he stood with the rest of Keth 7 and looked at the results displayed on a large screen. He was last. In every single category, not close to last. Last by a significant margin. Torak looked at the results and then looked at Ethan. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The numbers said everything, but Ethan noticed something that nobody else seemed to notice. Or maybe they noticed and did not care. In the endurance category, his score was not as far behind as in the others. He was still last, but the gap was smaller. Humans might not be the strongest or the fastest, but they could keep going long after other species stopped. It was one of the few biological advantages his species had: persistence, stubbornness, the simple animal refusal to lie down and die. He filed that observation away and said nothing. There would be time to show what that meant. For now, he just had to survive. And survival, as it turned out, was going to be harder than he thought. Because that evening, as he was walking back to his quarters through the dimly lit corridors of the residential block, he passed a group of senior cadets. They were Varathi, all of them, and they were blocking the corridor. One of them stepped forward as Ethan approached. "You are the human," the senior cadet said. His tone was not curious like Torak's had been. It was cold. "The Category 6. Ethan stopped walking. "That is what the file says. Files do not lie. You do not belong here. This academy has stood for 9,000 years and it has never admitted a species rated below Category 8. Your presence here is an insult." Ethan looked at the 5 Varathi cadets blocking his path. Each one was taller than him. Each one was faster than him. Each one had been training in combat since childhood. He was alone in a corridor with no witnesses and no help coming. "I am here because the academy admitted me," Ethan said, keeping his voice steady. "If you have a problem with that, take it up with the admissions board."
Whew. The senior cadet leaned closer.
His glowing eyes were narrow. I am taking it up with you. What happened next took about 4 seconds. The senior cadet reached for Ethan's collar. Ethan moved. Not with speed, because he could not match Veyratha's speed, but with something else. Something the senior cadet did not expect. Ethan moved with a total lack of hesitation, a willingness to act without the careful calculation that most species relied on. He grabbed the reaching hand, twisted his body, and used the senior cadet's own momentum to pull him off balance. The Veyrathi stumbled forward, and Ethan stepped to the side, letting him crash into the wall. The other 4 cadets stared. In their experience, a Category 6 species did not fight back against Category 9 Veyrathi. It simply did not happen. Ethan stood there, breathing hard, his heart hammering in his chest. He knew he could not win a fight against 5 Veyrathi cadets. He knew this with absolute certainty, but he also knew something else. He knew that the willingness to fight when you cannot win is itself a kind of weapon. It changes the equation. It makes the other side reconsider. The senior cadet pushed himself off the wall and turned to face Ethan. There was something in his expression that had not been there before. Not respect exactly, but something close to surprise. This is not overhuman, he said. I know, Ethan said. The 5 cadets moved past him and disappeared down the corridor. Ethan stood there for a long time, alone in the dim light, his hands shaking with adrenaline. Then he walked to his room, closed the door, and sat on his bed. Through the window, the gas giant stared down at the moon like an ancient eye watching something it had not seen before. Something small and fragile and unremarkable on paper, something that refused to be afraid. Somewhere deep in the archives of the Academy, in a section that had been sealed for 3,000 years, there was a document. It was written in a language so old that only a handful of beings in the galaxy could still read it. It spoke of a time of great change. It spoke of a war that would shake the foundations of everything the Council had built. And it spoke of one who had come from the least of species, one who carried no mark of power, no sign of greatness, no weight of legacy. One who would be written off and overlooked and dismissed. One who would change everything. The document had no title, but among the very few scholars who knew of its existence, it was called simply the Foretelling, and the Foretelling had been waiting a very long time for someone to fulfill it. It did not know it yet, but it had just stopped waiting, 3 weeks into the program, and Ethan Cole had learned something that no briefing file or diplomatic orientation had prepared him for. The galaxy did not simply underestimate humans. It had already decided what humans were and had no interest in being corrected. Every morning began the same way. He would wake before the alarm because his body had not fully adjusted to the 21-hour day cycle of Dravos, and he would lie in the dark of his small room and listen to the deep mechanical hum of the Academy around him. Then he would get up and begin again. The physical training was relentless. Sub-Commander Sereth pushed all of Keth 7 hard, but there was an extra quality to the way she watched Ethan. Not cruelty, not sympathy. Something more clinical than either. She was observing him the way a scientist observes an experiment, recording data, waiting to see what the data would reveal. Ethan's body hurt constantly. The gravity on Dravos was slightly higher than Earth's, which meant every step he took required fractionally more effort than his muscles were designed for. Over the course of a day, that added up. Over the course of 3 weeks, it had reshaped his body in ways he could feel but not yet see. His legs were stronger. His core was tighter, but the soreness never fully went away. He had learned to live with it the way you learn to live with a low sound that never stops. The classroom portion of the program was where things became interesting. Veyrath Academy did not simply train soldiers. It trained commanders. The curriculum covered military strategy, galactic history, political theory, advanced physics, xenobiology, and a dozen other subjects that Ethan had never encountered before. The classes were conducted in Veyrathi Standard, which his neural translator handled well enough, though there was always a slight lag that put him half a second behind everyone else in discussions. But in the classroom, something unexpected began to happen. Ethan was not the smartest cadet in Keth 7. That distinction belonged without question to Lyra Voss, the Orvani, whose mind processed information at a speed that sometimes left even the instructors blinking. But Ethan had a quality that the others did not seem to possess. He thought differently, not better, not worse, just differently. The first time it became noticeable was during a strategy simulation in their 4th week. The 12 cadets of Keth 7 were placed in a holographic war room and given a scenario. A fleet of enemy vessels was approaching a defended system. The cadets had to devise a defense strategy using limited resources. The simulation was a standard exercise that had been used at the academy for centuries, and there were well-established optimal solutions that any properly trained cadet should be able to identify. Lyra identified the optimal solution in under 2 minutes. The Veyrathi cadets arrived at the same solution shortly after. Torak and the other Draconini proposed a variation that emphasized brute force but was fundamentally similar. The Thessari and the Silvari agreed with the consensus. Ethan did not. He stood at the holographic display and stared at the map of the system for a long time while the others waited with varying degrees of impatience. Then he proposed something that made everyone in the room stop talking. "We should let them take the outer stations," he said. Sub-Commander Sereth raised one eyebrow. "Explain." "The optimal defense spreads our resources across all defensive positions. That is what the simulation expects. That is what any enemy commander would expect. But we are outnumbered and our ships are slower than theirs. If we spread out, we lose a war of attrition. Instead, we should pull everything back to the inner system. Let them take the outer stations. Let them think they are winning. Then we hit them here." He pointed to a narrow passage between two gas giants where the gravitational forces would limit the enemy fleet's ability to maneuver. "They come through in a line. We are waiting on the other side with everything we have. We lose the outer stations, but we destroy their fleet." There was silence in the room. "That strategy would result in significant civilian casualties on the outer stations," Lyra said. Her enormous eyes were fixed on Ethan with an expression he could not read. "Yes," Ethan said. "It would, and I hate that. But the alternative strategy has a 60% chance of losing the entire system. Every station, every civilian. If we sacrifice the outer ring, we save the inner system with over 90% probability. It is an ugly choice. But it is the right one." More silence. Sub-Commander Sarath looked at her own datapad for a long moment. Then she looked at Ethan. "Run the simulation with Cadet Cole's strategy," she said to the system. They watched the holographic battle play out. The enemy fleet swept through the outer system, taking the undefended stations with ease. They grew confident. They pushed inward. And when they came through the narrow passage between the two gas giants, the combined defensive fleet was waiting. The battle was brief and devastating. The enemy fleet was destroyed almost entirely. The simulation ended and displayed the results. Ethan's strategy had resulted in a 94% survival rate for the inner system. The civilian casualties on the outer stations were significant but far fewer than the total losses projected by the optimal defense strategy. Sub-Commander Sereth did not praise Ethan. She simply noted the results and moved on to the next exercise. But Ethan saw Torak looking at him from across the room, and this time the expression on the Draconani's face was easier to read. It was the beginning of respect. After the session, Lyra fell into step beside Ethan as they walked to the next class. She was so short that she barely reached his waist, but she moved with quick, precise steps that kept pace with his longer stride. "Your strategy was not in any of the established tactical databases," she said. "I checked." "I know," Ethan said. "Where did you learn it?" Ethan thought about that for a moment. "I did not learn it anywhere specific. Humans have a long history of being outmatched. We have been fighting things bigger and stronger and faster than us since before we could write. We learned early that sometimes the only way to win is to accept losses that the other side would never accept. We fight dirty. We make ugly choices. We sacrifice pieces to save the whole." Lyra was quiet for several steps. "That is a very unsettling philosophy." "Yes," Ethan agreed. "It is." Ethan remained last in physical rankings, but the gap narrowed slowly. So slowly that only someone tracking the numbers carefully would notice. His endurance scores crept upward. His body continued to adapt to the higher gravity and thinner air. He was not becoming stronger or faster in any absolute sense. It was simply becoming more efficient. His body was learning to do more with less, which was something human bodies had been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. In the classroom, his reputation shifted in small increments. He was never the first to answer a question, and he was never the most technically correct. But he consistently offered perspectives that the other cadets did not consider. In a xenobiology class about predator species, he explained the concept of persistence hunting, how ancient humans had hunted prey not by being faster or stronger, but by following it for hours and hours until the animal simply collapsed from exhaustion. The instructor, a theory professor with decades of experience, had paused and looked at Ethan for a very long time after that explanation. "You are describing a species that weaponized patience," the professor said. "I am describing my species," Ethan replied. The encounter with the senior cadets in the corridor was not repeated, but Ethan was aware that he was being watched. He saw the same Verithy faces in the dining hall, in the corridors, at the edges of training grounds. They were not threatening him. They were watching, waiting. He did not know for what. What he did not know, what he could not know, was that his presence had triggered something far larger than casual harassment. In the administrative levels of the academy, levels that cadets never saw and barely knew existed, conversations were taking place. High Commander Vorath Drain sat in his private office and reviewed the weekly reports on every training group. He had been doing this for over 100 years, and he could usually scan each report in seconds, noting only the exceptional performances and the critical failures. But for the past 3 weeks, he had been spending an unusual amount of time on the reports from Keth 7. "His physical scores are the lowest in the group," said his adjutant, a Verithy officer named Kale Reth, who stood on the other side of the desk. "I can read, Kale. Of course, Commander. But his trajectory is unusual. He is not simply maintaining. He is improving at a rate that exceeds the adaptation curves for Category 6 species." Vorath leaned back in his chair. His white eyes burned steadily in the dim room. What about his academic performance? Middle of the group in most subjects. But the strategy instructors have flagged his approach as anomalous. He consistently produces solutions that fall outside established tactical frameworks. Some of them are crude, but some of them are, and I quote the instructor's words, disturbingly effective. Vorath was quiet for a moment. "There was a strategy simulation, the Keth system defense scenario." "Yes, Commander." His solution deviated entirely from the optimal approach. It was messier, and it involved accepting losses that standard doctrine would consider unacceptable. But the simulation results were significantly better than the textbook solution. "I know. I watched the recording." Vorath turned his chair to face the window. Beyond the glass, the surface of Drevos stretched out cold and grey. "Do you know why I approved the humans' admission, Kale? The diplomatic request from the human coalition was, I do not do things for diplomatic reasons. I approved it because I wanted to see something." "See what, Commander?" Vorath did not answer immediately. He stared out the window at the barren landscape and thought about a document that he had read many years ago. A document written in a language that almost nobody spoke anymore. A document that spoke about a time that was coming and a being that would come with it. "Had the archives team unseal Section Crev 19, he said. Kale stiffened. "Commander, Section Crev 19 has been sealed for 3,000 years. Yes, have it unsealed. I want to review the contents personally." "Yes, Commander." After Kale left, Vorath sat alone in the dark of his office and thought about the human. About the way he had stood in front of 5 senior cadets and refused to back down. About the way he had looked at a problem that every species in the galaxy solved the same way and seen a completely different answer. About the way his body was changing, adapting, reshaping itself in response to conditions it was never designed for. Category 6. Unremarkable. Vorath was beginning to think that the system they used to categorize species was missing something very important. Meanwhile, Ethan was dealing with a more immediate problem. The midterm evaluations were approaching, and they included something called the Crucible. Every cadet at the academy went through the Crucible at the midpoint of their first year. It was a comprehensive test that evaluated everything: physical ability, tactical thinking, teamwork, leadership, and the ability to perform under extreme stress. The details of the Crucible were not shared with cadets in advance. The only thing everyone knew was that it was the single most common point of failure. More cadets were dismissed after the Crucible than at any other time in the program. Ethan had been doing his own research. He had talked to second-year cadets, the few who were willing to talk to a human, and had pieced together a rough picture. The Crucible involved a multi-day survival and combat scenario on the surface of Drevos. Outside the protected environment of the academy, teams of cadets were dropped in remote locations and given objectives to complete while dealing with environmental hazards, simulated enemy forces, and deliberate obstacles designed to break group cohesion. The surface of Drevos outside the academy was not hospitable. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below freezing at night. The terrain was a maze of rocky canyons and ridges carved by ancient geological forces. There were windstorms that could strip exposed skin in minutes. And there were creatures. Drevos had a native ecosystem of silicon-based organisms that had evolved in the extreme cold. Most of them were not dangerous. Some of them were very dangerous. Ethan began preparing in the only way he knew how. He trained harder. He spent extra hours in the environmental simulation chambers, exposing himself to conditions similar to the surface of Drevos. He studied the geological surveys of the moon's surface that were available in the Academy's database. He researched the native fauna, and he began reaching out to his teammates in Keth 7. This was the hardest part. Most of Keth 7 had settled into a pattern of tolerating Ethan rather than accepting him. They worked with him when the exercises required it and ignored him when they did not. The exception was Lyra, who had taken to sitting beside him in classes and asking him endless questions about human biology, history, and psychology. And Torak, who had developed a habit of walking with Ethan to training sessions, a silent companionship that Ethan appreciated more than he could express. But the rest of the group remained distant. The three Veyrathi cadets, Narev, Solan, and Daira, were polite but clearly uncomfortable with his presence. The silvery pair, whose names were Kess and Meili, operated as a unit and seemed to view everyone outside their partnership as secondary. The second Draconaya, a female named Breck, followed Torak's lead in most things but had never spoken to Ethan directly. And the 12th member of the group, a being from a species called the Vrethani who went by the name Os, communicated primarily through a complex system of color changes in its translucent skin and had not seemed to notice that Ethan existed. The Crucible would require them to function as a team, a real team, not 12 individuals who happened to share a training group designation. Ethan knew this. He also knew that building that team was not his job. He was the lowest-ranked member of the group. Nobody was going to follow his lead. But he could do something else. He could make himself useful in ways that the others could not ignore. He started small. He began arriving at training sessions early and setting up the equipment before anyone else got there. He memorized the preferences and habits of each team member and began anticipating their needs. When Torak struggled with a theoretical concept in tactical class, Ethan spent an evening breaking it down into simpler terms. When Lyra's environmental suit malfunctioned during a cold weather exercise, Ethan fixed it using skills from his years as a cargo ship mechanic. When Narev, the most hostile of the three Veyrathi cadets, came down with a mild respiratory illness that the medical bay could treat but not immediately cure, Ethan researched Veyrathi respiratory physiology and suggested a modification to Narev's breathing filter that reduced his symptoms significantly. He did these things without being asked and without expecting thanks. And slowly, incrementally, the temperature within Keth 7 began to change. One evening, about 2 weeks before the Crucible, Ethan was in the common room of their residential block, studying geological maps of the Drevos surface on his personal device. Torak entered the room and sat down across from him. The Draconai's gold eyes studied the maps on Ethan's screen. "You are preparing for the Crucible," Torak said. "Trying to. The rest of the group is not preparing together. That is a problem." Ethan looked up. "You have noticed that too." Torak's jaw tightened, which Ethan had learned was the Draconai equivalent of a frown. "We will fail as individuals. The Crucible is designed to identify groups that cannot function as units. Keth 7 is not a unit. It is 12 individuals who share a schedule." "I know. What do you think we should do about it?" "I think you should talk to them." Ethan almost laughed. "Torak, I am the last person they will listen to. I am the lowest-ranked cadet in the group. I am the wrong species. Half of them barely acknowledge that I am here." Torak leaned forward. His massive frame made the chair creak dangerously. "That is exactly why they will listen. You have nothing to lose and nothing to prove. When a Dracaani speaks of strength, others hear arrogance. When a Veyrathi speaks of duty, others hear condescension. When an Orvani speaks of logic, others hear judgment. But when you speak, they hear something different. They hear someone who should not be here at all, who has no advantage, no heritage, no rank to protect, and who is still here anyway. That means something, Ethan." Whether they admit it or not, Ethan stared at the Dracarani for a long time. In 3 months at the academy, It was the most anyone had said to him about what his presence meant, and it had come from the least likely source. "All right," Ethan said, "help me set up a meeting." The meeting happened 2 days later in one of the small group study rooms attached to their residential block. Getting everyone there had required Torak's physical presence, Lyra's persistent messaging, and a small amount of what Ethan suspected was guilt. All 12 members of Keth 7 sat around the table and looked at Ethan with expressions ranging from curiosity to annoyance. Ethan stood at one end of the table and felt the weight of 11 pairs of alien eyes on him. He had prepared a speech in his head. It was structured and logical, and hit all the right points about teamwork and shared goals. He threw it away and spoke from somewhere deeper. "I know most of you did not want me here," he said. "I understand why. On paper, I am the weakest member of this group. On paper, I bring down your averages. On paper, I am a liability. And I cannot stand here and tell you that paper is wrong, because it is not. I am slower than all of you. I am weaker than most of you. I did not grow up training for this." He paused and looked at each of them in turn. Narev's arms were crossed. Kess and Melee exchanged a glance. Breck was watching Torak rather than Ethan, but everyone was listening. "But here is what paper does not show. Paper does not show that I have been learning from every single one of you since the day I arrived. Narev, you have the best spatial awareness of anyone in the group. You map a room before you walk into it. Kess and Melee, you coordinate movement without speaking, which means you have a communication method that could be invaluable in situations where comms are down. Lyra, you process information faster than the Academy's tactical computers. Torak, you are the strongest being I have ever seen, and you use that strength with more control and precision than anyone gives you credit for. Breck, you are the best shot in the group by a factor of 3. Solon and Dyra, your endurance scores are the highest among the Vairathi cadets in our entire year. The Thessary twins, you can fly and you can see in spectrums that the rest of us cannot. And Os. He looked at the Frithani whose skin was cycling through pale blues and greens. Os, I have no idea what you are fully capable of because you have not shown us yet, and I suspect that is deliberate. Os's skin flashed a brief, bright orange, which the translator indicated was the equivalent of surprise. "The Crucible is coming," Ethan continued. "I can go into it as 12 individuals and we will be torn apart. Or we can go in as a team and we can show this academy something it has never seen before." "I cannot make that choice for you, but I am asking you to make it." The room was quiet. Then Lyra spoke. "He is correct. Statistical analysis of Crucible outcomes over the past 200 years shows a direct correlation between pre-Crucible group cohesion and survival rates. Groups that train together informally before the Crucible had a completion rate of 89%. Groups that did not had a completion rate of 41%. I did not need statistics to know that," Torak said. "But I appreciate the confirmation." Narev uncrossed his arms. He looked at Ethan with an expression that was no longer hostile. "It was something more complex. You studied all of us, our strengths, our patterns." "I watch people," Ethan said. "It is what my species does. We are not the strongest or the fastest, but we are very good at paying attention." Then Narev said something that Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. "My grandmother fought in the border wars. She told me once that the most dangerous soldier is not the one with the biggest weapon. It is the one who knows where everyone else is standing. I think she would have found you interesting, human. It was not acceptance." "Not exactly, but it was a door opening. Just a crack." From that night on, Keth 7 began training together. Not just during scheduled sessions, but in the evenings and early mornings. In the spare hours that most cadets used for rest or personal study, they ran drills in the environmental simulation chambers. They practiced communication protocols. They learned each other's strengths and weaknesses and began building strategies that used all 12 of them as integrated parts of a single functioning unit. Sub-Commander Sereth noticed. She did not comment, but Ethan saw her watching their informal sessions through the observation windows of the training rooms. And once, just once, he thought he saw her smile. What none of them knew was that far above them, in the sealed and guarded depths of Section Krev 19, High Commander Vorath Drain was standing in a room that had not been opened in 3,000 years. The room was circular, with walls covered in carvings so old they predated the academy itself. At the center of the room, on a pedestal of black stone, sat a crystalline object roughly the size of a human fist. It pulsed with a faint inner light, a rhythm that was almost like a heartbeat. Vorath read the carvings on the walls. His command of the ancient language was imperfect, but he understood enough. The carvings spoke of cycles, of endings and beginnings, of a darkness that would come from beyond the known galaxy, and a light that would rise to meet it. And they spoke of the one who would carry that light. Not the strongest, not the wisest, not the oldest, the one who adapted, the one who refused to fall, the one who came from nothing and became everything. Vorath placed his hand on the crystal and felt it pulse against his palm. It was warm. It had been cold for 3,000 years, and now it was warm. He closed his eyes and thought about a human cadet who was, at that very moment, teaching a group of aliens how to work together as a team. A human cadet who was last in every physical ranking and yet somehow pulling his training group together through sheer stubborn refusal to accept the limits others had placed on him. The crystal pulsed faster. Vorath opened his eyes and looked at it. The light inside was brighter now, much brighter. "So," he said to the empty room, "it is time." The crystal had no answer, but its light continued to grow. The crucible began without warning. That was the point. At some hour deep in the artificial night of the academy, the lights in every first-year cadet's room went dark. Not the usual dimming that signaled sleep cycle, true darkness. The environmental systems cut off. The temperature began to drop immediately. And then a voice came through the intercom system, cold and mechanical and utterly without sympathy. "All first-year cadets report to your designated assembly points. You have 8 minutes. The crucible has begun." Ethan was out of bed before the message finished. His body moved on the reflexes that weeks of training had beaten into it. Uniform on, boots sealed, emergency kit grabbed from the storage unit beside his bed. He was out the door in 90 seconds and running through corridors that were pitch black except for faint emergency strips along the floor. He reached the Keth 7 assembly point, a small staging room near the eastern launch bays, and found that he was not the first one there. Lyra was already present, her enormous eyes perfectly suited to the darkness. Tarak arrived seconds after Ethan, his heavy footsteps shaking the floor. The others came in ones and twos over the next few minutes. Kess and Maley moved in perfect unison, even in the dark. The Thessary twins arrived on silent wings. Os drifted in last, its translucent body glowing faintly with agitated colors. All 12 present, under the 8-minute limit. Sub-Commander Sereth was waiting for them. She wore full combat gear and her expression was carved from stone. Beside her stood a Drakani officer Ethan did not recognize, equally armed and equally grim. "Keth 7, Sereth said. "You are being deployed to Grid Sector 41 on the northern surface of Drevos. Your objective is to reach a designated extraction point 70 kilometers from your drop zone within 72 hours. Along the route you will encounter obstacles, environmental hazards, and simulated hostile forces. Your performance will be evaluated on the following criteria: survival, objective completion, team cohesion, individual contribution, and adaptability." She paused, and her glowing eyes swept across each of them. "This is not a simulation. You will be on the actual surface of Drevos in actual conditions. The cold will be real. The terrain will be real. The dangers will be real. Medical teams are on standby, but response time to the northern sectors is between 20 and 40 minutes depending on conditions. Do you understand?" 12 voices answered yes in various languages and frequencies. "Board the transport. Now." They filed into a small military dropship that was nothing like the comfortable transport that had brought them to Drevos weeks ago. This was a metal box with bench seats and no windows. The air inside was already cold. The engines screamed to life before the last cadet was seated, and the ship launched with a force that pressed them all back against their restraints. Ethan sat between Torak and Lyra. In the dim, red emergency lighting of the dropship, the faces of his teammates looked strange and alien in ways that he usually did not notice. He could see the faint luminescence of the Veyrithi cadet's eyes, the metallic sheen of Torak's natural bone plating, the prismatic shimmer of the Thessari's crystalline wings folded tight against their backs, the slow cycling colors of Os's body. He was surrounded by beings from across the galaxy, each one shaped by a different world and a different evolution, and in a few minutes they would be thrown into an environment hostile to all of them. "Remember what we practiced," Ethan said, not loudly but in the cramped space everyone heard. We move as a unit. Nobody gets left behind. We use each other's strengths to cover each other's weaknesses. That is how we get through this. The human thinks he is giving a motivational speech, Narev said from across the aisle. But there was no malice in his voice. If anything, there was a dry humor that Ethan had learned to recognize as the Vairathi version of camaraderie. Somebody has to, Torak rumbled. The dropship banked hard and began its descent. Through the hull, Ethan could hear the shriek of Drevos's thin atmosphere tearing past the ship. Then the engines cut out, and they dropped. The impact when they hit the surface was hard enough to rattle teeth. The rear hatch blew open, and wind rushed in, carrying a cold so intense it felt like being hit in the face with a fist. Ethan was the first one out. He had trained for this. The cold slammed into him, and for a moment his lungs refused to work. And his thermal suit kicked in, and the worst of it was blunted, though blunted on Drevos still meant brutally cold by any human standard. He stumbled forward across rocky ground and looked around. They had been dropped in a narrow canyon. The walls rose on either side, dark rock streaked with veins of something that glowed faintly blue. The sky above was a strip of deep violet, and the gas giant hung at the edge of visibility, casting an amber light that gave everything long, strange shadows. The wind howled through the canyon like something alive. The others piled out behind him. Torak's massive form dropped to the ground with a thud. The Thessary twins launched into the air immediately, their crystalline wings catching the wind as they gained altitude to survey the surroundings. Lyra activated a small scanning device and began collecting environmental data. Temperature is -31 degrees, she reported. Wind speed 40 kilometers per hour with gusts up to 70. Atmosphere is breathable, but oxygen content is 13% below optimal for most of our species. The canyon runs roughly north to south. Our extraction point is to the northeast. The extraction point was 70 kilometers away, across some of the most brutal terrain on the moon. They had 72 hours. That meant they needed to cover roughly 1 kilometer per hour, accounting for rest, obstacles, and the inevitable complications. It sounded manageable on paper, but paper did not account for the temperature or the terrain or the things that lived in it. We move in standard formation, Ethan said. He looked at the group and saw that they were looking at him, not at Torak, who was the physically dominant member, not at Narev or Solon, who were the highest ranked on academic metrics. They were looking at him. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, and he was not sure any of them even realized they were doing it. But it happened. Thessary on aerial chronoconus, rotating shifts so neither of you exhausts your wings in this wind. Torak and Breck take point. Kes and Melee on flanks. Narev, Solon, and Dyra form the core with Lyra. Os, you take rear guard. I will move between positions as needed. Nobody argued. They moved. The first 12 hours were a brutal slog through the canyon system. The terrain was uneven and treacherous, littered with loose rocks and sudden drops. The wind never stopped. It found every gap in their thermal suits and drove needles of cold into their skin. Twice they had to stop and reseal Lyra's suit, which was not designed for someone her size and kept developing gaps at the joints. Ethan's body burned. The cold was a constant drain on his energy, forcing his metabolism to work overtime just to maintain core temperature. He ate from his ration pack at regular intervals, small, dense bars of nutrients that tasted like compressed sawdust but kept his body fueled. The other species had their own challenges. Torak's natural armor, while protective, made him heavier and slower on the uneven ground. The Thessary could not fly for extended periods in the high winds and had to walk, which they were not built for. Os's translucent body lost heat faster than anyone else's, and the Vrathani had to be wrapped in additional thermal layers stripped from the emergency supplies in their kits. But they moved, together as a unit, and that made all the difference. The first simulated attack came at hour 14. They had emerged from the canyon system onto a wide rocky plateau and were making good time when the Thessary scout, Veth, dove down from altitude with wings folded tight. 12, maybe 15, entrenched along the ridgeline. Ethan dropped to a crouch and the others followed. He crawled forward to the edge of a rock formation and looked at the ridge. He could see the faint shimmer of holographic projectors that would simulate weapons fire. Getting hit by a projector would trigger the scoring system and count as a casualty. Too many casualties and the group would fail. Standard assault tactics say we should split into fire teams and advance under covering fire, Narev said from beside him. The Vairathi had moved with surprising silence. Standard tactics assume we have equal or superior firepower, Ethan replied. We have training weapons with limited charge. If we assault the ridge directly, we will take casualties. Then what do you suggest? Ethan looked at the terrain. He looked at the wind. He looked at the sky. Then he looked at the members of his team, and something clicked in his mind. A connection between all the things he had observed and learned over the past weeks. Os, he said. Can you modulate your bioluminescence to match the ambient light of the rocks? Os's skin flickered in surprised patterns. Then it shifted, cycling through shades of grey and dark blue until the Vrethani was nearly invisible against the ground. Ethan felt a surge of satisfaction. He had suspected Os could do this, but had never had a reason to ask. Os moves around the left flank, completely camouflaged. When Os is in position behind the ridge, Os signals us by pulsing red. At that point, Tarak and Breck charge the center of the ridge. They draw all the fire. While the hostiles are focused on the two biggest targets, Kess and Melee move in from the right. Thessary dive from above, and Os disrupts them from behind. We hit them from 4 directions at once. What about the rest of us? Dyra asked. Narev, Solon, Dyra, you provide covering fire from this position to pin them down. Lyra, you coordinate timing using your scanner to track everyone's position. And I will go with Os. Torak looked at him. You are not camouflaged, but I am small and I am very good at moving quietly. I will stay behind Os and handle anything that goes wrong on the flanking route. It was a complicated plan. It required precise timing and coordination between 5 separate elements. If any one piece failed, the whole thing could collapse. But they had practiced together. They had learned each other's rhythms and capabilities. And when Ethan looked at the 11 faces around him, he saw something that had not been there 8 weeks ago. Trust. Go, he said. The assault on the ridge went almost perfectly. Os's camouflage was so effective that the simulated hostiles did not detect the Vrethani until Os was literally standing among them. Torak and Breck's charge drew exactly the response Ethan had predicted. Kess and Melee moved with their characteristic silent coordination. Their Thessary dove out of the violet sky like crystalline missiles, and when it was over, all 12 simulated hostiles were neutralized and Keth 7 had taken 0 casualties. 0. Against a force that outnumbered them. Somewhere in the monitoring station back at the academy, the officers watching the Crucible feeds exchanged glances. 0 casualties on the first engagement was rare. It was not unheard of, but it was rare, and the tactical approach was unlike anything in the standard playbook. They pressed on. The terrain grew worse. The canyon system gave way to a broken landscape of jagged rock formations and deep crevasses that had to be crossed with ropes and careful climbing. The temperature continued to drop as they moved further north. By hour 24, it was 42 degrees below zero, and the wind had picked up to sustained speeds of 60 kilometers per hour. Ethan was suffering. His thermal suit was working at maximum capacity, and it was not enough. His fingers were numb despite the gloves. His face was raw from the wind. Every breath was a small agony as the frigid air scraped down his throat and into his lungs. He could feel his body starting to slow, his reactions becoming fractionally less sharp as his core temperature fought against the relentless cold. He had to, because the moment he stopped, the moment any of them stopped, the cold would win. At hour 28, they encountered their second major obstacle. Not a simulated attack. Something real. Veth, the Thessary scout, came down from a reconnaissance flight with crystalline wings trembling from cold and exertion. There is a crevasse ahead. It spans the entire width of our route. It is approximately 30 meters wide, and I could not see the bottom. They gathered at the edge of the crevasse and looked down. Veth was right. The gap was enormous. A wound in the surface of Drevos that dropped into absolute darkness. The walls of the crevasse were smooth and nearly vertical. There was no way around it. Their route to the extraction point required them to cross. The Thessari can fly across, Narev said. In this wind, barely, Veth replied. And we cannot carry anyone. The gusts would pull us down. We have 50 meters of high tensile rope in our equipment, Lyra said, already calculating. If we can anchor it on both sides, we can cross hand over hand. How do we get the rope to the other side? Solon asked. Everyone looked at the gap. 30 meters. Too far to throw a rope in this wind. Too wide to jump. The Thessari could barely manage the crossing themselves in the gusting conditions. Ethan looked at the crevasse and then he looked at the terrain around them. His eyes moved across the rock formations on both sides. He saw something. A formation on their side that curved outward over the crevasse, extending maybe 8 meters past the edge. On the other side, a similar formation extended about 6 meters. That still left 16 meters of open air. Torak, Ethan said. How far can you throw a grapple? In this wind, perhaps 20 meters accurately. If you stand on the end of that rock formation, the target on the other side would be about 16 meters away. Can you hit it? Torak looked at the formation. He looked at the other side. I can hit it. Then we have a plan. Torak moves out onto the formation, throws the grapple to the far side, and we anchor the rope. Breck, you are the second strongest. You anchor our side. The formation may not support Torak's weight, Lyra warned. It will hold, Torak said. He was already moving toward the rock formation, testing the stone with each step. When he reached the point where it extended over the void, he paused and looked down into the darkness. Then he looked at Ethan. If I fall, continue without me. Nobody gets left behind, Ethan said. That was the rule. Torak made his jaw-tightening expression that passed for a Draconite smile. Then I had better not fall. He stepped out onto the overhang. The rock groaned under his weight. Everyone held their breath. Torak moved carefully, distributing his mass as evenly as possible, until he reached the furthest point. He was now 8 meters out over the crevasse with nothing below him but darkness and cold air. He pulled the grapple from his belt, attached the rope, swung it twice to build momentum, and threw. The grapple sailed across the gap, fighting the wind, and caught on the rock formation on the far side. Torak pulled the rope taut and tested it. It held. The crossing took an hour. Each member of Keth 7 clipped onto the rope with a carabiner and pulled themselves across hand over hand, suspended over the abyss with the wind trying to tear them free. Ethan went second to last, just before Breck, who served as the final anchor. Halfway across, a gust of wind hit him so hard that his grip slipped, and for one terrible second he was hanging by a single hand over infinite darkness. The cold had made his fingers slow and stupid, and he could not feel the rope properly. He swung in the wind, legs dangling, and for a moment he thought, this is where it ends. Then his other hand found the rope again. He gripped it with everything he had and pulled himself forward, 1 agonizing meter at a time until he reached the other side and collapsed onto solid rock. Torak pulled him to his feet. You did not fall. I made a rule about that. Ethan gasped. They continued north. Hour 35. The landscape shifted from broken rock to a vast flat expanse of frozen ground that crunched under their feet like glass. The gas giant dominated the sky, its amber light turning the frozen landscape into something that looked like it belonged in a painting rather than reality. There was a terrible beauty to Drevos that Ethan could appreciate even through his exhaustion. The second simulated attack came at hour 42, and it was much worse than the first. 20 simulated hostiles with superior positioning on high ground, attacking during what was supposed to be their rest period. Keth 7 was tired, cold, and running low on energy reserves. A lesser group would have been overwhelmed, but they were not a lesser group. Not anymore. Ethan's mind, sharpened by exhaustion into something lean and clear, processed the battlefield in seconds. He saw the angles. He saw the weaknesses. And he gave orders that his team followed without hesitation, not because he was the strongest or the smartest or the highest ranked, but because they had learned to trust the way his mind worked. They lost 2 simulated casualties in the engagement. Narev took a hit covering Lyra's position. Melee was tagged during the flanking maneuver. Both were marked as wounded rather than killed, which meant they could continue but with penalties to their scores. It was not the clean victory of the first engagement, but they held their ground and neutralized the hostile force. After the engagement, while the others rested in a defensive perimeter, Ethan sat with his back against a rock and looked up at the sky. His body was screaming at him to stop. Every joint ached. His muscles felt like they had been replaced with something heavy and useless. The cold had penetrated to a level that his thermal suit could not reach. A deep bone cold that made him feel like he was slowly being hollowed out from the inside. But his mind was clear. Clearer than it had any right to be. There was something happening to him that he did not fully understand. The more his body suffered, the sharper his thinking became. It was as if the physical hardship was stripping away everything unnecessary and leaving behind only the essential. He could see patterns in the terrain that he would have missed when comfortable. He could anticipate problems before they emerged. He could feel the rhythm of his team's movement and know instinctively when something was wrong. He did not know it, but this was something that the ancient texts in section Kreb 19 had a name for. They called it the awakening, not a supernatural event, not magic, something deeper and more fundamental than that. The texts described it as the moment when a being's true capacity reveals itself, when the pressure of circumstance burns away the comfortable limitations that ordinary life imposes and exposes the raw potential underneath. The text said it happened to the one who was foretold, the one from the least species, the one who adapted. Back at the academy, High Commander Vorath was watching the crucible feeds in his office. He had not slept. He had not moved from his chair in hours. His wide eyes were fixed on the holographic display that showed the 12 members of Keth 7 moving across the frozen surface of Drevos. He watched the way the others oriented around him. He watched the impossible clarity of the tactical decisions that emerged from a mind that should have been shutting down from cold and exhaustion. And he watched the readings from the biomonitor that every cadet wore, readings that showed something anomalous happening in the human's neurological activity. Brain function was not decreasing with physical stress as it did in every other species. Dust. It was increasing. Vorath pulled up the relevant passage from the foretelling and read it again. He had memorized it by now, but he read it anyway. When the body fails, the fire rises. When all strength is spent, the true strength awakens. The least among them will not break where others break. The least among them will burn brighter as the darkness grows deeper. This is the sign. This is the mark that bears no mark. This is how you will know the one who is foretold. Vorath closed the text and stared at the human on his screen. The human who was currently leading 11 aliens across a frozen wasteland through sheer force of will. The human whose brain was doing something that no Category 6 species should be capable of. He reached for his communication device and opened a channel to a frequency that had not been used in a very long time. This is High Commander Vorath Drain of Veyrath Academy. I am invoking Protocol Krev. Contact the Inner Council. Tell them the sign has appeared. On the other end of the frequency, there was a long silence. Then, a voice, old and thin, and carrying the weight of unimaginable years, spoke a single word. Where? Here, Vorath said. In a human. The silence that followed was even longer. When the ancient voice spoke again, it carried an emotion that beings of that age rarely displayed. It carried something very close to awe. We are coming. Keth 7 reached the extraction point at hour 61, 11 hours ahead of the deadline. They came in together, all 12 of them, battered and frozen and running on fumes, but walking upright and walking together. Narev was limping from a simulated wound. Arsa dimmed to an almost colorless translucency from the cold. Lyra was being carried on Torak's broad back because her legs had given out 4 hours ago. But they were all there. Nobody left behind. The extraction point was a flat clearing surrounded by marker beacons that glowed pale blue against the frozen ground. 2 Academy transport ships sat waiting, their engines idling and their hatches open. Medical personnel stood by with thermal blankets and nutrient packs. As Keth 7 crossed into the clearing, Ethan saw Sub-Commander Sereth standing near the closest ship. She was watching them, with an expression he had never seen on her face before. She was impressed. She was trying very hard not to show it, but she was impressed. Ethan's legs gave out about 10 meters from the ship. His body had simply reached the end of what it could do. He went down on one knee and then both knees, and the frozen ground hit him like a slab of ice through his suit. He could not feel his hands or his feet. His vision was narrowing at the edges. The world was becoming a tunnel with only the open hatch of the transport at the end. Then Torak was there. The Draconai lifted Ethan off the ground with one arm, as easily as picking up a child, and carried him the rest of the way to the ship. He set Ethan down on one of the heated seats inside and wrapped a thermal blanket around him. You did not fall, Torak said, and despite the cold and the pain and the near delirium of exhaustion, Ethan recognized it for what it was. The same words he had said to Torak at the crevasse returned with a meaning that went beyond their surface. The transport lifted off, and the warmth of the cabin's environmental systems began to seep into Ethan's frozen body. It hurt. Returning sensation always hurt worse than losing it. He clenched his teeth and endured, and eventually the shaking stopped and his vision cleared. Around him, the other members of Keth-7 were in various states of recovery. The medical personnel moved between them, administering species-specific treatments. Lyra was conscious again, her enormous eyes blinking rapidly as an Orvani medic administered a neural stimulant. The Thessary twins had their wings spread across heated pads designed to restore circulation to the delicate crystalline membranes. Narev and the other Vairathi were drinking something hot from sealed containers, their blue skin slowly regaining its natural luminescence. For a few minutes, nobody spoke. They just sat and breathed and existed in the simple miracle of warmth. Then Breck, the female Drakani who had barely spoken to Ethan in months, leaned across the aisle and said something that nobody expected. "Next time, human, maybe we let you give the motivational speech at the beginning and the end." There was a moment of silence. Then Narev laughed. It was a strange sound, higher pitched than a human laugh and carrying harmonics that vibrated in Ethan's chest, but it was unmistakably laughter. And then Torak was laughing, a deep rumble, and Lyra was making a rapid clicking sound that her species used to express amusement. And one by one, all 12 members of Keth-7 were laughing together in the heated cabin of a military transport flying over the frozen surface of an alien moon. And for the first time since he had arrived at the academy, he did not feel alone. They returned to the academy and were given 48 hours of mandatory rest before the results of the crucible were released. Ethan spent most of those hours sleeping in his modified room, waking only to eat and to answer messages from Lyra, who apparently did not require rest and wanted to discuss the thermodynamic properties of human perspiration at sub-zero temperatures. On the second day, he ventured out to the common area and found Torak waiting for him. The Draka Ani was sitting in one of the reinforced chairs, staring at a holographic display on the wall that showed a rolling feed of Academy news and announcements. "Something is happening," Torak said when Ethan sat down across from him. "What do you mean?" "There are ships arriving. I counted 7 since yesterday. Not standard transports. Diplomatic vessels. 2 of them are classes I have never seen before, and I have studied every ship classification in the Galactic Registry." "Diplomatic vessels at a military academy?" "Exactly. And there are officers in the corridors that do not belong to the academy staff. I saw 3 beings this morning that were wearing council insignia. Not regional council. The High Council. The High Council. The governing body of the entire galactic civilization. 12 members, each representing one of the elder races. They did not leave the council chambers on Veratha Prime for anything short of a galactic emergency. "Maybe it is related to the Crucible," Ethan said. Though even as he said it, he knew it did not sound right. The Crucible was important to the Academy, but it was a routine evaluation. It would not draw the attention of the High Council. "Maybe," Torak said. He did not sound convinced either. The Crucible results were posted the following morning. Every cadet in the first year gathered in the main assembly hall, thousands of them arranged by training group, and the results were displayed on massive holographic screens that hung from the ceiling like glowing clouds. Ethan found the Keth-7 results and read them with his heart in his throat. Keth-7 had placed first. Overall, first out of over 300 training groups, their combat engagement scores were the highest in the year. Their completion time was the 3rd fastest. Their team cohesion rating was, according to the scoring system, the highest ever recorded in the history of the Crucible. Ethan stared at those words. Highest ever recorded. In 9,000 years of the Academy's existence, his individual scores were still the lowest in the group for physical performance, but his tactical score was the highest. Not just in Keth-7, the highest individual tactical score in the entire first-year class. And there was a note beside his name that he did not understand. It said flagged for council review. The assembly hall was buzzing with the noise of thousands of cadets reacting to their results. Some were celebrating. Some were quiet with the knowledge that their scores meant they would be sent home. Keth-7 stood together in a tight group and looked at their results and looked at each other, and there was a moment that passed between them, silent and powerful, a shared understanding that what they had accomplished belonged to all of them equally. Then Narev put his hand on Ethan's shoulder. It was the first time any of the Vairathi cadets had voluntarily touched him. "Highest tactical score in the year," Narev said. "For a Category 6, that is not bad. For any category, that is exceptional," Lyra corrected with her characteristic precision. The celebration was short-lived. That afternoon, Ethan received a message on his personal device. It was brief and formal. It instructed him to report to the administrative level of the Academy at 1800 hours. The message was signed by High Commander Vorath Drain personally. Ethan had never been to the administrative levels. He knew they existed above the educational and training facilities, separated by security checkpoints that cadets did not have clearance to pass. But the message came with a temporary access code that opened doors that had been closed to him since his arrival. He rode a lift up through levels he had never seen. The architecture changed as he ascended. The dark, functional design of the lower levels gave way to something older and grander. The corridors were wider. The walls were carved with patterns that seemed to shift when he was not looking directly at them. The air was different too, warmer and carrying a faint scent that reminded him of old libraries and ancient stone. He reached the level specified in the message and stepped out of the lift into a corridor that was empty and silent. The floor was polished to a mirror finish. At the far end, a single door stood open, spilling golden light into the dim hallway. He walked toward it, his footsteps echoing in the silence, and stepped through. The room beyond was large and circular. The ceiling was a dome of transparent material through which the gas giant and the stars were visible, turning the room into something like the inside of an enormous eye looking up at the universe. Around the edges of the room, seated in chairs that seemed to have grown from the floor itself, were beings. Ethan stopped in the doorway and felt the air leave his lungs. He recognized them, not individually, but by type, by the weight of presence they carried, by the insignia they wore. These were not academy officers. These were not diplomats or politicians. These were members of the High Council of the Galactic Union, the rulers of a civilization that spanned 100,000 star systems. There were 7 of them present. A Vairathi, ancient beyond imagining, with skin so dark it seemed to absorb the light and eyes that burned like dying stars. A Draconai, even larger than Torak, wearing armor that looked like it had been forged from starlight. A Silvery who sat perfectly still, so still that she might have been a sculpture, if not for the faint blur of micro-movements that betrayed her species' restless biology. An Orvani whose head was disproportionately large even by their standards, with eyes that seemed to contain entire galaxies. And 3 beings of species Ethan did not recognize, each radiating a quiet power that made the air in the room feel thick and charged. At the center of the room, standing rather than sitting, was High Commander Vorath Drain. And beside him, on a pedestal that seemed to be made of light rather than matter, was a crystalline object roughly the size of a fist. It was pulsing with a steady, warm glow, and Ethan could have sworn it was pulsing faster since he had entered the room. "Ethan Cole," Vorath said. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent to it, a tension that Ethan had never heard from the High Commander before.
Thank you for coming. Please enter.
Ethan walked into the room. He was acutely aware of every eye upon him. 7 of the most powerful beings in the galaxy were watching him the way he imagined astronomers watched a star right before it did something unexpected. "Sit," Vorath said, indicating a chair that had been placed in the center of the room, facing the assembled council members. Ethan sat. His heart was beating hard, but his mind was clear. That sharpness he had discovered during the Crucible was back. The sense that pressure was not his enemy, but his fuel. "I will be direct," Vorath said. "What I am about to tell you will change your understanding of why you are here. It will change your understanding of many things. I asked that you listen completely before you respond." Ethan nodded. Vorath turned to the crystal on the pedestal and placed his hand beside it without touching it. "This object is called the Resonance. It is older than this academy. It is older than the Galactic Union. It is older than any civilization currently in existence. It was found on this moon 12,000 years ago by the first Vairathi explorers, and the academy was built here, in part to protect it." He paused and looked at Ethan. "The Resonance is not a weapon. It is not a power source. As far as we understand it, it is a detector. It was created by a species so ancient that we have no record of them except the things they left behind. And its purpose, the only purpose we have ever been able to determine, is to respond to a specific pattern, a specific type of consciousness." Vorath stepped back from the pedestal. "For 12,000 years, the Resonance has been dormant, cold, and dark. Every cadet who has ever passed through this academy has been within its detection range, and it has never responded. Millions of beings from thousands of species over thousands of years. Nothing. He looked at Ethan with those burning white eyes. "Until you arrived. On the day you set foot on Drevos, the resonance began to glow, and it has been growing brighter every day since." Ethan stared at the crystal. The pulsing light inside it was undeniable. It was warm and steady, and it seemed to be synchronized with something. With a cold shock of realization, he understood what it was synchronized with. It was pulsing in time with his heartbeat. "There are texts," Vorath continued. "Ancient texts written in a language that predates all known civilizations. They were found alongside the resonance. For 3,000 years they were sealed away because they described events that had not yet occurred. Events that our scholars believed might never occur. The texts speak of a time of great danger, a threat that will come from beyond the boundaries of known space. And they speak of the one who will stand against that threat." The ancient Vairathi Council member spoke for the first time. Her voice was like wind through dry leaves, papery and fragile, but carrying an authority that made the air vibrate. The texts described this individual in specific terms, not by species or by name, but by qualities. The one who adapts, the one who endures, the one who leads not through strength or brilliance, but through the ability to bring others together. The one whose mind sharpens under pressure rather than dulling. The one who comes from the least of species and carries no mark of power. She leaned forward in her chair and fixed Ethan with eyes that had seen millennia pass. "We have been waiting a very long time, young human, and every sign we were told to watch for points to you." The room was silent except for the faint pulse of the resonance. Ethan sat in his chair and felt the weight of what was being said settle onto him like a physical thing. His first instinct was disbelief. His second instinct was to look for the hidden cameras, because surely this was some kind of elaborate test or prank. But the faces around him were not the faces of people playing a joke. They were the faces of people confronting something they had been preparing for across generations. "With respect," Ethan said, and his voice was steadier than he expected. "I am a mechanic from a cargo ship. I have been at this academy for less than 4 months. I finished last in every physical test. The only reason my training group succeeded in the Crucible is because they are extraordinary individuals who learn to work together."
And who taught them to work together? The Drakani Council member asked.
His voice was like boulders grinding against each other. Ethan did not have an answer for that. "You speak of yourself as unremarkable," Vorath said. "That is precisely what the foretelling says you would do. The one who is foretold does not recognize what they are. They cannot. Because what makes them extraordinary is not a power they possess. It is a potential they embody. A potential that reveals itself only under pressure, only through adversity, only when the situation demands more than any ordinary being can give. Your neural patterns during the Crucible were unprecedented," the Orvani Council member said. His enormous eyes blinked slowly. "Under conditions of extreme physical stress, your brain function did not decrease. It increased. Dramatically. This is not a known capability of your species. It is not a known capability of any species. Our scientists have reviewed the data 9 times. There is no error." Ethan thought about those moments during the Crucible when the cold was at its worst, and his body was failing and his mind had become something bright and sharp and clear. He had assumed it was adrenaline. He had assumed everyone experienced something similar. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" he said. Vorath looked at the council members. Something passed between them, an understanding forged over years of discussion and debate and waiting. Then Vorath looked back at Ethan. "We are not asking you to do anything yet. We are telling you what we believe you are. The decision of what to do with that knowledge is yours. But I need you to understand something, Ethan. The threat the foretelling describes is not hypothetical. Our deep space monitoring networks have been detecting anomalous readings at the edge of known space for the past 18 months. Something is out there. Something is coming. And every model our scientists have run says that our current military capabilities are insufficient to stop it." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. "What kind of something? We do not know. The readings are unlike anything in our records. What we do know is that whatever it is large, it is moving toward inhabited space, and it is accelerating." The room was very quiet. Ethan looked at the crystal on its pedestal, pulsing with warm light in rhythm with his heart. He looked at the faces of the 7 most powerful beings in the galaxy, beings who had ruled civilizations older than human history, and he saw something in their eyes that terrified him more than anything else. He saw hope. They were looking at him with hope. These ancient, powerful beings who had ships that could crack planets and weapons that could extinguish stars were looking at a 22-year-old human mechanic with hope, because whatever was coming was so terrible that all their power and all their technology and all their thousands of years of civilization were not enough. "I need to think," Ethan said. "Of course," Vorath said. "Take the time you need, but understand that time is the one resource we have in diminishing supply." His legs were unsteady, but he forced them to work. He walked to the door of the circular room, feeling the weight of 7 pairs of ancient eyes on his back. At the threshold, he stopped and turned. "The foretelling?" he said. "Does it say how this ends?" The ancient Verathi council member answered. Her voice was softer now, carrying something that might have been compassion or might have been sorrow. "The texts are incomplete. The ending was never recorded. Or perhaps it was never written. Perhaps the ending is something that has not been decided yet." Ethan nodded. He stepped through the door and walked down the long mirrored corridor to the lift. He rode down through the levels of the academy in silence, past the administrative floors and the educational levels and the training facilities, down to the residential block where his room was. He walked to his door and pressed his hand to the panel. The door opened and he stopped. Torak was inside, sitting on the floor because the chair was too small for him. Lyra was perched on the desk. Nerev leaned against the wall, and behind them, crowded into a room designed for one small human, was the rest of Keth 7, all 11 of them. Even Os, whose translucent body glowed with soft questioning colors in the small space. "We saw you go up to the administrative levels," Lyra said. "Cadets are never called to the administrative levels. We were concerned." "We are your team," Torak said simply. "Where you go, we need to know." 11 aliens crammed into his tiny room, waiting for him because they were worried about him. A Drakaani who could crush him with one hand. A Verathi who had once told him he did not belong here. An Orvani who could outthink any computer. Silvery who could outrun light. Thessary who could fly. A Vrathani who could become invisible. All of them looking at him with the same expression. He sat down on his bed and told them everything. The silence that followed was long. Lyra was the first to process it, as always. "The statistical probability of a prophecy being accurately fulfilled is functionally 0, she said. "However, the resonance is a measurable physical phenomenon that responds to your presence. That is not prophecy. That is data." "The foretelling is real among the elder races," Nerev said quietly. "My family has served the Verathi military for 17 generations. I grew up hearing stories about the one who would come. I always assumed they were legends. Legends are just history that survived long enough to become unbelievable," Ethan said. Torak stood up, and in the small room his standing was like a mountain rising. "What do you need?" "What? You said the council told you something is coming? Something that threatens everything? And they believe you have a role to play in facing it. So I am asking you, what do you need?" Ethan looked around the room, at every face. At every pair of eyes, glowing and dark and enormous and faceted and cycling with color. These were his people now, not by blood or species or world of origin, but by something deeper, by shared suffering and shared triumph, and the bonds that form when you walk through frozen darkness together and refuse to leave anyone behind. "I need exactly what I have," Ethan said. "I need my team." Os's skin pulsed a color that Ethan had never seen from the Vrathani before. The translator had no word for it. But every being in the room understood it anyway. It meant yes. It meant always. It meant we are with you to whatever end. Outside the small window of room 1917, the gas giant hung in the violet sky like an ancient guardian watching over something precious. And far beyond it, past the outer reaches of the star system and the borders of known space, something vast and dark continued its approach. It had no name that any living species would recognize. It had no form that existing senses could properly define. It was old. Older than the resonance. Older than the foretelling. And it was hungry in a way that had nothing to do with physical consumption and everything to do with ending things. It had consumed civilizations before. It had devoured stars and darkened galaxies and left nothing behind but silence and void. It moved through the spaces between stars like a thought moving through a sleeping mind, vast and formless and inevitable. But for the first time in its incomprehensible existence, Something was different. Somewhere ahead of it, in the direction it was traveling, there was a light it did not recognize. Small and warm and stubborn. A light that pulsed like a heartbeat. A light that was growing stronger. It did not understand the light. It did not fear the light. It had never feared anything, because nothing had ever survived its approach long enough to justify fear. But it noticed. And for a thing that had consumed everything in its path for longer than stars had existed, noticing was new. Noticing was the first step towards something it had never experienced. Noticing was the beginning of uncertainty. And uncertainty, as every human knows, is the beginning of everything. The news spread through the academy like fire through dry grass, though the official version bore little resemblance to the truth. The official version said that Cadet Ethan Cole had been selected for a special advanced program due to exceptional performance during the Crucible. The official version said that certain members of the High Council were visiting the Academy for routine inspection purposes. The official version said everything was normal. Nobody believed the official version. Within days, Ethan went from being the human curiosity to something else entirely. Cadets who had never spoken to him began stopping him in corridors to ask questions. Senior cadets who had once blocked his path now stepped aside when he walked past. The group of Verithi who had confronted him months ago were nowhere to be seen. In their place was a charged atmosphere of curiosity and unease, and something that bordered on reverence from species whose cultural memories included stories about the foretelling. He hated the way people looked at him now. He preferred the contempt. At least contempt was honest. This new attention felt like wearing a costume that did not fit, and no matter how many times he told himself that nothing about him had changed, the galaxy around him had decided otherwise. His training continued, but now it was different. Vorath had restructured his program personally. Mornings were still spent with Keth 7, running the standard curriculum alongside his teammates, but afternoons and evenings were devoted to sessions that no other cadet had access to. Advanced strategic warfare, deep space threat assessment, command psychology, and something that had no formal name but which Ethan came to think of as the pressure sessions. The pressure sessions took place in a sealed chamber deep in the administrative levels. The room was equipped with neural monitoring systems that tracked his brain activity in real time. The Orvani council member, whose name was Elder Voss and who turned out to be a distant relative of Lyra's, oversaw these sessions personally. The concept was simple. They put Ethan under stress and measured what happened. Not physical stress, although there was some of that. Psychological stress. Cognitive stress. The kind of stress that comes from being presented with impossible problems, contradictory information, moral dilemmas with no right answer, and escalating pressure to make decisions that affect millions of theoretical lives. And every time, the same thing happened. As the pressure increased, Ethan's neural activity spiked in ways that defied everything the Orvani understood about neuroscience. His pattern recognition accelerated. His decision-making became faster and more accurate. His ability to synthesize disparate information into coherent strategies improved dramatically. He did not become smarter in the traditional sense. He became more adapted. His mind reshaped itself in real time to meet the demands being placed on it. After one particularly intense session that had left Ethan with a headache that felt like a knife behind his eyes, Elder Voss sat down across from him and spoke with a candor that the Orvani council member had not previously shown. I have studied cognitive function across 412 species for the entirety of my career, Voss said. I have never observed anything like what your brain does under duress. Every other species we have tested shows cognitive degradation under sustained pressure, slower processing, reduced creativity, impaired judgment. Your species should show the same pattern. Your neural architecture is not fundamentally different from dozens of other carbon-based intelligent species. But it is different, Ethan said. Yes, it is different, and I believe I understand why. Voss's enormous eyes blinked slowly. Your species evolved under conditions of constant existential threat. Not just for thousands of years, but for hundreds of thousands of years. You were prey before you were predators. Your planet tried to kill you with ice ages and volcanic eruptions and disease and drought and 1,000 other calamities. And through all of it, the individuals who survived were the ones whose minds worked better under pressure, not worse. You did not just evolve to endure stress. You evolved to be enhanced by it. Stress is not your enemy. It is your catalyst. Ethan thought about that. He thought about the long history of his species. All the wars and disasters and near extinctions that had shaped human biology into what it was. He thought about the saying that what does not kill you makes you stronger, and realized that for humans, it was not just a saying. It was a biological fact encoded into the deepest structures of their brains. The resonance detects this, Voss continued. I believe the ancient species that created it understood something about consciousness that we are only now beginning to grasp. They understood that there is a quality, a capacity for adaptive response under pressure that represents the highest expression of conscious intelligence. It is not about raw processing power or physical strength or any of the metrics we use to categorize species. It is about potential, the ability to become what the moment demands. And among all the millions of beings who have passed through this academy over the millennia, you are the first one whose mind exhibits that quality to the degree the resonance was designed to detect. Is it just me? Ethan asked. Or is it all humans? We do not know. The resonance responds to you specifically, which suggests it is detecting something beyond a general species trait. Perhaps it is a rare expression of that trait. Perhaps it is the trait amplified by specific life experiences and neural development. We would need to test more humans to understand, and the Council has not yet approved broader contact. That conversation stayed with Ethan. It changed the way he understood himself, not in a grandiose way. He did not feel like a chosen hero from a legend. He felt like someone who had been given information about the nature of his own mind and was trying to figure out what to do with it. What he did with it, in the immediate term, was train. He trained harder than he had ever trained in his life, not just in the pressure sessions, but in everything. He threw himself into the advanced strategic coursework with an intensity that surprised even Vorath. He studied the deep space monitoring data on the approaching threat, spending hours poring over readings that the Academy's best analysts were still trying to interpret. And he continued training with Keth 7, because no matter what the foretelling said, or the resonance detected, or the Council believed, Ethan knew in his bones that he was nothing without his team. Keth 7 had changed too. The knowledge of what was happening, which Ethan had shared with them fully despite the Council's preference for secrecy, had transformed the group dynamic. They were no longer just a training team. They were something closer to a family bound by a shared sense of purpose that went beyond grades and rankings and career advancement. Torak began training in advanced heavy combat techniques with a focus and ferocity that alarmed even the Draka Ani instructors. Narev dove into intelligence analysis, applying the Vayrithi gift for spatial awareness to the interpretation of deep space sensor data. Lyra worked with Elder Voss on developing new models for understanding the approaching threat. Kess and Melee developed enhanced coordination protocols that they began teaching to other Silvery cadets. The Thessary twins, Beth and Sarah, experimented with flight combat techniques adapted for deep space environments. Breck trained with every weapon system the Academy had. Solon and Dyra focused on logistics and supply chain management for extended operations. And Os, the quiet, enigmatic Vrethany, revealed a capability that nobody had suspected. Os could interface with electronic systems through direct physical contact, reading and manipulating data through the same biochemical processes that controlled the color changes in Vrethany's skin. Each of them was preparing in their own way for something that was still months or years away, but that felt closer every day, because the deep space readings were getting stronger. 3 months after the Council's revelation, at a point when the Academy's first-year program was halfway complete, the readings changed. Not gradually, not incrementally. They changed suddenly and dramatically in the span of a single night. Ethan was pulled from sleep by an emergency alert on his personal device, not the training alert of the Crucible. A real alert, priority 1. When he reached the command center that Vorath had given Keth 7 access to, the rest of the team was already there, along with Vorath, Elder Voss, and several other council members who had remained at the Academy. A holographic display in the center of the room showed the edge of known space. The anomalous readings were represented as a dark shape against the background of stars and nebulae. 3 months ago, the shape had been vague and distant. Now it was defined and close, much closer than any model had predicted. It accelerated, Lyra said, her eyes racing across the data streams. 12 hours ago, it was projected to reach the outer systems in 18 months. Current trajectory puts it at the border of inhabited space in 6 weeks. The number fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Can we see it? Ethan asked. Not the sensor data, the actual object. Vorath nodded to a technician. who adjusted the display. The holographic projection shifted from sensor readings to a composite visual reconstruction based on long-range observational data. Ethan had expected something. A ship, perhaps? A fleet, some kind of physical structure that could be understood and therefore confronted. What he saw instead made his stomach drop. It was a void. Not empty space, which at least contained scattered particles and background radiation, and the faint light of distant stars. This was the absence of everything. A region of space where nothing existed. Not matter, not energy, not even the fundamental quantum fields that formed the substrate of physical reality. It was as if someone had taken an eraser to the universe and simply removed a section. And it was enormous. The visual reconstruction showed it against a reference grid, and the scale made Ethan's mind stutter. It was larger than star systems, larger than the gaps between star systems. It was a wound in reality itself, and it was moving toward everything that lived and breathed and existed. We call it the absence, Vorath said quietly. We have been tracking it for 2 years. Our earliest models suggested it was a natural phenomenon, a region of space with unusual properties. Those models were wrong. It is not natural, Elder Voss confirmed. Analysis of its behavior shows intentional patterns. It changes direction. It accelerates and decelerates. It moves toward concentrations of matter and energy. It is consuming the universe as it goes, converting everything it touches into more of itself. More nothing. The foretelling describes exactly this, the ancient Vaethi council member said from her seat in the corner of the room. She was so old and so still that Ethan sometimes forgot she was there until she spoke. The darkness that devours, the emptiness that hungers, the ending of all things. And the foretelling says I am supposed to stop that? Ethan said, looking at the void on the display that could swallow civilizations whole. How? What am I supposed to do against something that eats reality? Nobody answered immediately. Because nobody knew. Ethan stared at the display for a long time. He let the fear wash through him, acknowledged it, and set it aside. This was what he did. This was what humans did. They looked at impossible things, and instead of accepting impossibility, they started looking for the edges, the weaknesses, the places where impossible became merely very difficult. Lyra, he said. The absence reacts to concentrations of matter and energy. It moves toward them. That means it has preferences. That means it has priorities. And anything that has priorities can be predicted. Lyra's eyes widened fractionally. You want to model its decision-making process. I want to understand it. Not as a force of nature, as an adversary. Every adversary has patterns. Every adversary has blind spots. Every adversary makes assumptions about how its opponents will behave. If we can understand how the absence thinks, if it thinks, we can find a way to use that against it. You are talking about applying tactical doctrine to an entity the size of a nebula, Narev said. I am talking about the only thing I know how to do. I am not a scientist. I am not a weapon. I am someone who looks at a problem and figures out how to win even when winning seems impossible. That is what my species does. That is what we have always done. The room was quiet. Then Torak stood up from his reinforced chair, rising to his full height like a wall of living rock. Tell us the plan, the Dracani said. There was no plan. Not yet. But in the weeks that followed, Ethan and Keth 7 and every resource the Academy and the Council could provide worked to build one. They studied every scrap of data on the absence. They ran simulations until the holographic systems overheated. They debated and argued and failed and started over again and again. And Ethan's mind did what it always did under pressure. It got sharper. The patterns emerged slowly at first, like shapes forming in fog. The absence did not move randomly. It was drawn to certain types of energy emissions more than others. It changed direction when it encountered specific configurations of matter. It had, buried deep in its behavior, something that looked almost like curiosity. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m, on a night when Ethan had not slept in 36 hours. He was alone in the command center, surrounded by holographic data, his eyes burning and his body running on caffeine and stubbornness. He was looking at a comparison between the absence's movement patterns and the energy signature of the resonance crystal. And he saw it. The resonance and the absence had the same fundamental frequency. Not identical, but related. Like two notes in a chord, like mirror images of the same pattern. The resonance was creation. Consciousness, the capacity for adaptive growth. The absence was its opposite. Entropy, the cessation of all change. They were two halves of something. And the reason the ancient species had built the resonance was not just to detect a specific type of consciousness. It was to create a counterbalance, a point of resistance, a seed of adaptive potential that could grow to match the absence, the way a living immune system grows to match an invading pathogen, not by being larger or more powerful, but by being more adaptable. By changing faster than the threat could consume, Ethan sat in the empty command center and felt the pieces lock into place with a clarity that was almost painful. He understood now. Not fully. Not in detail. But the shape of it was there. The absence was entropy. Stagnation. The end of all change. And the antidote to entropy was not power. It was adaptation. Growth. The stubborn insistence on changing, evolving, becoming something new in response to whatever the universe threw at you. That was why the resonance had chosen him. Not because he was strong, or smart, or special in any measurable way. Because he embodied the principle that opposed the absence, the human principle, the refusal to accept that the current state of things was the final state. The deep biological conviction that no matter how bad things got, there was always another adaptation, another strategy, another way forward. He contacted the council that morning. He stood in front of the 7 most powerful beings in the galaxy and a room full of officers and scientists and the 11 members of his team. And he laid out what he had found. "We cannot fight the absence with weapons," he said. "It consumes energy. Shooting at it would feed it. We cannot flee from it because it is accelerating and it will eventually consume everything. We cannot negotiate with it because it is not interested in communication. It is interested in ending things." He brought up the frequency analysis on the display, but we can match it. The resonance is tuned to the same fundamental frequency as the absence. It is a key designed to fit a specific lock, and I believe the lock is not the absence itself. It is the boundary between the absence and normal space. The edge where everything meets nothing. You said my mind adapts under pressure. It reshapes itself to meet demands. If the resonance can amplify that quality, if it can broadcast it outward the way the absence broadcasts entropy, then we can create a boundary that the absence cannot cross. Not a wall, nothing that rigid. A living boundary that adapts and changes and evolves faster than the absence can consume. A barrier made of the same principle that kept my species alive through 100 extinction events. Scientists argued with military officers. Council members debated with each other. Lyra was already running calculations on her device, her fingers moving faster than Ethan's eyes could track. But Vorath was silent. He stood at the edge of the room and watched Ethan with those burning white eyes, and when the noise died down, he spoke. "What do you need?" Ethan looked at his team. 11 faces looked back at him. Torak, immovable and loyal. Lyra, brilliant and precise. Narev, sharp and honest. Kess and Maley, fluid and inseparable. Breck, steady and lethal. Solon and Dyra, enduring and reliable. Veth and Sarah, swift and fearless. Os, invisible and full of surprises. "I need a ship," Ethan said. "I need my team, and I need the resonance. We have to go to the edge of the absence. We have to go where everything ends, and show it something it has never encountered before." "And what is that?" Vorath asked. Ethan smiled. It was a small smile, tired and scared, but real. Something that refuses to end. They left 4 days later. A single ship, modified beyond recognition by the combined engineering resources of the Academy and the Council. 12 cadets who had been training together for less than a year. And a crystal older than any civilization, pulsing with warm light in a chamber at the heart of the ship, beating in time with a human heart. The journey to the edge of the absence took 9 days. 9 days of faster-than-light travel through increasingly empty space, as the stars around them thinned and the darkness between them grew wider and deeper. Ethan spent the journey preparing, running scenarios with Lyra, training combat drills with Torak and Breck, reviewing communication protocols with Kess and Maley, learning everything Os could teach him about interfacing with the ship's systems, and he sat with the resonance. For hours at a time, alone in the chamber, He sat with the crystal and let his mind open. He felt it respond to his thoughts, not with words or images, but with something more fundamental. A resonance, a harmony. The sense that two things designed to work together were finally in proximity. On the 9th day, they dropped out of faster-than-light travel and the absence filled their view screen. It was beyond comprehension. A wall of nothing that stretched in every direction, so vast that the concept of size lost meaning. There were no stars beyond it, no light, no matter, just the absolute termination of everything that existed. And at its edge, where reality met unreality, the boundary rippled and shifted like the surface of a black ocean. Ethan stood on the bridge of the ship and looked at it. His heart was pounding, his hands were shaking. Every survival instinct in his body was screaming at him to run, but his mind was clear, clearer than it had ever been. "Bring us to within 1,000 kilometers of the boundary," he said. Narev, who was at the helm, looked at him. "At that range, if the boundary fluctuates, we will be consumed." "I know. Take us in." The ship moved forward. The absence grew until it was all they could see, a vast dark wall that seemed to lean toward them. The instruments on the bridge began to fluctuate. The lights dimmed. The temperature dropped. Ethan felt the resonance pulse in the chamber below. It was beating faster now, responding to the proximity of its counterpart. He could feel it in his chest, a warmth that spread outward from his center like a second heartbeat. "Hold position," he said. "Activate the resonance amplification array." The modifications to the ship included a system designed by Lyra and Elder Voss to amplify and broadcast the resonance's signal. When Oss interfaced directly with the ship's systems, activated it, Ethan felt something happen that he could not describe in any language. The resonance opened. Not physically. The crystal remained on its pedestal, but something inside it expanded, reached out, and connected with something inside Ethan. His mind was suddenly vast. He could feel the boundary of the absence the way you feel the edge of a table in a dark room, a presence defined by the space it occupied. And he could feel the absence itself, the immense, ancient, incomprehensible hunger of it. It noticed him. For the second time in its existence, the absence noticed something. And Ethan, connected to the resonance, amplified by the technology of a desperate galaxy, enhanced by a brain that evolution had designed to sharpen under exactly this kind of impossible pressure, reached out to the boundary and did something that no force in the universe had ever done before. He pushed back, not with energy, not with matter, with the principle that his species embodied more purely than any other. Adaptation. Change. The refusal to accept an ending. He poured it into the boundary like water into a crack in stone, and the boundary responded. Where the absence consumed, the boundary grew back. Where entropy ate away at the fabric of reality, new patterns formed, complex and dynamic and alive. The boundary became what Ethan had described, a living edge, an immune response, a system that evolved faster than the absence could destroy. The absence pushed, the boundary adapted. The absence pushed harder, the boundary changed and grew and became something new. It was not winning in the traditional sense. It was persisting. It was enduring. It was doing what humans had done since the first proto-human ancestor picked up a rock and refused to be eaten. The effort was immense. Ethan felt it draining him, pulling at the edges of his consciousness like a tide trying to drag him under. His nose was bleeding. His vision was darkening. The resonance was burning hot and bright, channeling more energy than it had ever been designed to handle. Then he felt them. His team. Torak's unyielding strength anchoring him. Lyra's brilliant precision guiding the energy flow. Narev's sharp awareness monitoring the boundary. Kess and Maley's fluid coordination keeping the ship stable. Breck's steady hands on the weapons systems, ready for anything. Solon and Dyra keeping every system running at peak efficiency. Veth and Sarah monitoring the space around them with inhuman vigilance. And Oss connected to the ship and through the ship to the resonance and through the resonance to Ethan, serving as the bridge that held everything together. 12 beings from 12 species, working as one. The galaxy in miniature. Everything the absence was not, concentrated in a single ship at the edge of everything. The boundary stabilized, not temporarily, permanently. The living edge that Ethan had seeded took root and began to propagate on its own, spreading along the front of the absence like grass growing across bare earth. Not fast, but steady. relentless, adapting to every attempt the absence made to consume it. Ethan pulled back. The connection to the resonance faded. He collapsed on the bridge, caught by Torak before he hit the floor. His body was spent. His mind was dim and fogged. But through the blur of exhaustion, he could see the view screen. The boundary was glowing. A thin, bright line of light between everything and nothing, pulsing with the same warm rhythm as the resonance. As his heart beat, it was alive. It was growing. And the absence, for the first time in its ancient, terrible existence, had stopped advancing. Lyra's voice came from somewhere above him, rapid and precise. The boundary is self-sustaining. It is drawing energy from background radiation and converting it into adaptive structures. The propagation rate is accelerating. At current trajectory, it will encompass the entire front of the absence within approximately 14 months. "It is working," Narev said. There was something in his voice that Ethan had never heard from the Vairathi. "Ah, of course it is working," Torak rumbled, holding Ethan upright with one massive arm. "He told us it would." His eyes were closing. The exhaustion was pulling him down into darkness, but it was a warm darkness, not the cold void of the absence. It was the darkness of rest after labor, of peace after struggle. "Get us home," he whispered, and then consciousness left him. He woke up 3 days later in the medical bay of Vairath Academy. The first thing he saw was the ceiling of the bay, plain and white and real. The second thing he saw was Torak, sitting in a chair beside his bed that was comically too small for the Drakaani. "You are awake," Torak said. "How long?" "The council has been waiting to speak with you. The news has spread to every inhabited system. The absence has been halted. The boundary holds." Ethan lay there and let the words settle into him. The boundary holds. 2 words that meant the survival of everything that existed. "The others?" he asked. "All fine. Lyra has been monitoring the boundary data continuously. She has slept 4 hours in 3 days and claims she does not need more. Narev has been fielding communications from every military command in the galaxy. Oz has become something of a celebrity among the Vrathani. It seems that their role in the mission has elevated their entire species' standing. Kess and Melee have been offered positions in the Silvery High Command, which they declined. Breck and I arm wrestled while you were unconscious. I won. Barely." Ethan laughed. It hurt his entire body, but he laughed anyway. Over the following weeks, the galaxy came to terms with what had happened. The boundary continued to grow, a living wall of adaptive potential that held the absence at bay. Scientists from every species studied it. Military commanders monitored it, and the Council formally addressed the galactic population for the first time in a century. They spoke of the foretelling, of the resonance, of the threat that had come from beyond known space and the response that had met it. And they spoke of the being at the center of it all, a human, a member of a species so recently arrived on the galactic stage that their file had been marked with a single dismissive word: unremarkable. The Council formally struck that word from the record. In its place, they entered a new designation, one that had never been applied to any species in the 60,000-year history of the galactic catalogue. Category 1. Exceptional without limit. Ethan did not attend the ceremony where the designation was announced. He was in the common room of the Eastern Residential Block, sitting with the 11 members of Keth 7. Torak was complaining about the portion sizes. Lyra was explaining a mathematical proof to Narev, who was pretending to understand. Kess and Melee were having an entire conversation in micro-gestures that nobody else could follow. The Thessary twins were comparing wing-stretching techniques. Breck was sharpening a blade she was not technically supposed to have. Solon and Dyra were arguing about supply logistics for a training exercise that was 2 weeks away. And Os was cycling through colors so contentedly that the translator could only approximate the emotion as deep belonging. Ethan sat among them and ate and listened and felt the quiet pulse of the resonance crystal, which now sat in a secured chamber beneath the academy, beating steadily like a second heart for the entire moon. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the transport ship with its thin, coppery air, the first morning of physical training where he had finished last in everything, the corridor where 5 Vairathi cadets had tried to break him, the frozen hell of the Crucible, the circular room where the most powerful beings in the galaxy had looked at him with hope, the edge of the absence, where he had stood at the boundary between everything and nothing. and pushed back with a force that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with the stubborn, irrational, glorious human refusal to accept defeat. He had been just another cadet on paper, a Category 6 from a species the galaxy had already dismissed. And now the paper had been rewritten, not because of what he was, but because of what he had shown the galaxy about the nature of potential itself. The gas giant hung in the sky outside the window, amber and vast and eternal. Somewhere beyond it, at the edge of known space, a boundary of living light held back the darkness. And on a small moon, orbiting that gas giant, in a room full of aliens who had become family, a human who had once been a mechanic on a cargo ship finished his meal and started thinking about what came next. Because that was the thing about humans. They always wanted to know what came next. And the universe, which had been watching with increasing fascination since a small blue planet first sent signals into the dark, leaned in a little closer to see